The massive airplane sat on the runway, its engines humming, ready for takeoff. The pilot, Captain James Carter, checked his instruments one last time before signaling for departure. But just as he was about to push forward, the co-pilot's voice cracked through the radio. Captain, you might want to look outside." James frowned. "What is it?" "There's a dog, sitting right in front of the plane." James turned his head and saw it through the windshield. A German shepherd sitting firmly on the tarmac, staring straight at the aircraft. It wasn't moving. It wasn't scared. It just sat there, as if guarding something. The ground crew waved, their arms trying to shoo the dog away, but it wouldn't budge. Airport security hesitated, not wanting to harm it, but they had no idea what to do. James sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'll handle this." As he stepped out onto the runway, the wind howled around him. The German shepherd didn't flinch, just kept staring at the plane like it was waiting for him. James took a few cautious steps forward. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Then the dog did something strange. It lowered its head slightly, almost like a bow. And that's when James noticed there was something clenched in its jaws, a small, tattered piece of fabric. James's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded. That fabric, he had seen it before. No, it couldn't be. His legs felt heavy as he took another step forward, his mind racing. How did this dog get here? Why was it blocking the plane? And why did it have that in its mouth? Something wasn't right. And deep down, James knew. This wasn't just a dog, this was a message, a warning. And whatever it was trying to tell him, it was big. James swallowed hard, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The German shepherd still hadn't moved. Its sharp brown eyes stayed locked onto him, unwavering. The ground crew muttered behind him. Someone radioed the tower, asking what to do. But James ignored the noise. His focus was on the dog and that torn piece of fabric. Slowly, he crouched, down, extending a hand. "Hey, boy, what's going on?" The dog let out a low whine, ears twitching. Then carefully it took a step forward and dropped the fabric at his feet. James hesitated. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The second he felt the worn-out cloth in his hands, his stomach twisted into a knot. He did recognize it. It was part of a flight jacket, but not just any flight jacket. It was the same kind his best friend, Daniel, used to wear, the same Daniel who had disappeared 5 years ago. The memory hit James like a punch to the gut. Daniel had been a co-pilot on a private flight, a routine trip over the mountains. But something went wrong. The plane lost contact mid-air. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies. Just gone. James squeezed the fabric, his mind spinning. Where did this dog get this? He looked back at the shepherd, who now stood completely still. The wind ruffled its thick fur, but it didn't waver. It was waiting for him to understand. "Captain Carter." A sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. One of the airport security officers jogged toward him. "Sir, we need to move this dog immediately. The flight is delayed." James stood up. "No one touches this dog." The officer frowned. "Excuse me. You heard me." James turned back to the dog, his voice firm. "This isn't some stray. This dog is trying to tell us something." The shepherd gave a single bark, as if confirming his words. Then, without warning, it spun around and bolted down the runway. "Hey, wait!" James took off after it, his boots pounding against the asphalt. The dog wasn't running away. It was leading him, and James knew. He had to follow. James ran after. The German shepherd, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. The dog sprinted across the tarmac with purpose, weaving between airport vehicles and crew members as if it knew exactly where it was going. "Captain Carter!" someone yelled behind him. "Where are you going?" James ignored them. He didn't care about the flight delay, the confused security team, or the dozens of passengers waiting on board. Right now, nothing mattered except this dog and what it was trying to show him. The shepherd led him past the runway and toward a restricted area near an old maintenance hangar. The closer they got, the stronger a strange feeling twisted in James's gut. The dog suddenly stopped near a chain-link fence. It turned to James, panting, and let out a deep bark, loud and urgent. James skidded to a stop, gripping the fence. Beyond it, the abandoned hangar loomed in the afternoon light, its metal doors rusted, its windows cracked. No one had used this place in years. "What is it, boy?" James whispered, scanning the area. The dog paced in front of the fence, agitated. Then it lowered its head and started digging furiously at the dirt. Dust and gravel flew into the air, and within seconds, something metallic glinted beneath the soil. James's chest tightened. He reached through the fence and brushed away the remaining dirt. It was a badge, a pilot's badge. And stamped into the metal were the initials, D.R. Daniel. James's stomach dropped. He felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. This couldn't be real. This badge belonged to Daniel. But Daniel had been gone for 5 years. His plane had never been found. How was this here? James slowly looked up at the shepherd, his hands shaking. "Where did you find this?" he whispered. The dog didn't move. It just stared at him, eyes full of something James couldn't quite place. It wasn't just urgency. It was pain. A deep, heartbreaking pain. James turned back to the hangar. Suddenly, the quiet felt deafening. The wind barely made a sound. The air felt heavier. And in that moment, James knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. James' fingers clenched around the pilot's badge as a chill ran down his spine. The German shepherd stood still, its eyes fixed on the hangar ahead. For a brief moment, James hesitated. 5 years. 5 years since Daniel's plane vanished. 5 years of silence. No clues, no answers. And now, out of nowhere, a dog appears with a piece of Daniel's flight jacket, leading him straight to an abandoned hangar. Something was very wrong. He turned back to the dog. "You're telling me he was here?" The shepherd let out a soft whimper, then trotted toward a small gap under the fence. Without hesitation, it squeezed through and dashed toward the hangar. James didn't think twice. He climbed over the fence, landing hard on the other side. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rusted metal. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, but he forced himself forward. The dog stopped near the hangar doors, sniffing the ground. Then, it let out a low, rumbling growl. James swallowed hard. His heart pounded against his ribs as he reached for the handle. The door was stiff, but with a hard yank it groaned open. Darkness, thick, suffocating darkness. James pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dust-filled air, revealing old equipment, rusted toolboxes, and his breath hitched. Footprints, fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. The shepherd padded forward, ears perked, body tense. It was listening, watching, waiting. James took a cautious step inside. His boots echoed against the concrete floor. The deeper he went, the more uneasy he felt. Then, tap, tap, tap. James froze, a sound, somewhere in the back of the hangar. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. The shepherd bared its teeth, letting out a deep, threatening growl. James tightened his grip on the badge. His pulse pounded in his ears. Someone else was here, and they didn't want to be found. The hangar's secret. James held his breath, listening. The footsteps had stopped. Silence swallowed the hangar, thick and heavy. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind rattling the metal walls. The German shepherd stood beside him, ears erect, body tense, ready for whatever was lurking in the shadows. James lifted his phone, the flashlight beam trembling slightly. He slowly scanned the dark interior, moving past rusted shelves, broken tools and piles of forgotten crates. Then, a shadow shifted. Near the back wall, James's stomach clenched. His fingers tightened around the pilot's badge in his hand. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but controlled. No answer. The dog let out a warning growl, stepping forward. James swallowed hard. He had 2 choices, turn around and leave, or step deeper into the unknown, but he already knew the answer. He took a step forward, then another, and then a loud clatter echoed through the hangar. James jerked his flashlight toward the sound. A metal chair had toppled over. His heart pounded in his chest. Someone had definitely been here. But where were they now? The Discovery James moved cautiously, scanning every corner. The shepherd was just as focused, sniffing the ground, tracking something unseen. Then the dog stopped. It stood in front of a heavy-looking storage cabinet, its tail stiff, body rigid. James felt a fresh wave of unease wash over him. He stepped closer and reached for the cabinet handle. It was locked. The dog barked, sharp and urgent. James frowned. He grabbed the side of the cabinet and gave it a hard pull. It didn't budge. But when he pressed his ear against it, he heard something faint, something that made his blood run cold. A weak, muffled thump. James took a shaky breath. Someone, or something, was inside. He looked around, searching for something to break the lock. His eyes landed on a rusted crowbar leaning against a nearby crate. Snatching it up, he wedged the metal between the cabinet doors and pushed with all his strength. The lock groaned, resisting. Then, crack, the lock snapped. The cabinet doors swung, open, and inside. A man lay curled up, his body weak and frail, his clothes ragged. His face was hidden under a mess of unkempt hair, but when he slowly lifted his head, James's breath caught in his throat. Those eyes, that face, it was impossible. But there was no doubt, it was Daniel. Shock and questions, James staggered back, his mind reeling. Daniel? His voice barely came out. The man blinked, his face pale, lips dry. James. His voice was hoarse, weak, like he hadn't spoken in days. James's pulse pounded in his ears. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. How was Daniel here? How had he survived? Where had he been for the last 5 years? And most importantly, who had locked him inside this cabinet? The German shepherd let out a soft whine and nudged Daniel's arm. Daniel gave a weak smile, lifting a trembling hand to stroke the dog's head. You found him, James whispered, barely believing what he was seeing. Daniel nodded weakly. His eyes flickered with something dark, something James couldn't quite place. They never wanted me to leave, Daniel rasped. James's stomach turned. They? Before he could ask, Daniel's gaze snapped to something behind James. His expression changed in an instant, from relief to terror. James, run! The chase begins. James barely had time to react before, bang! A gunshot rang through the hangar. The shepherd barked wildly, and James instinctively ducked, his heart hammering in his chest. The bullet ricocheted off a metal crate behind him, sending sparks flying. Someone was here, and they didn't want Daniel to leave. James turned to see a dark figure emerging from the shadows, a pistol gripped tightly in their hand. Their face was obscured by a black mask, but their posture screamed danger. Daniel, still weak, tried to stand but collapsed back against the cabinet. His legs barely held him. James grabbed him by the arm. Come on, we have to move. But before they could, take a step, another shot. It barely missed. The shepherd lunged forward with a vicious snarl, charging at the masked figure. The attacker staggered back, caught off guard. James didn't waste a second. He threw Daniel's arm over his shoulder and half-dragged, half-carried him toward the hangar doors. The dog fought fiercely, snapping and growling, buying them precious seconds. James's mind raced. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they kept Daniel alive all these years? But there was no time for answers. They had to escape. Now, escape under fire. The moment James reached the exit, another shot blasted through the air. The shepherd yelped but kept running, sprinting toward them. Go! James shouted. Outside, the night was thick with fog. The airfield stretched endlessly before them, empty except for the single airplane James had arrived in. That was their only chance. James tightened his grip on Daniel and ran. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. Footsteps pounded behind them. The masked figure was giving chase. Halfway to the plane, Daniel groaned in pain. I can't keep up. Yes, you can, James gritted through his teeth. Just a little more. The shepherd ran beside them, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the plane. The cockpit was still open. James had left it that way when he arrived. The IZ masked figure was getting closer. James could hear their breath, the rapid crunch of gravel under their boots. Any second now, another shot could come. Then the shepherd turned. In a flash, the dog leaped at the attacker, knocking them off balance. A surprised grunt escaped the masked figure as they stumbled, hitting the ground hard. James didn't dare stop to see what happened next. They reached the plane. James threw open the door and shoved Daniel inside. The shepherd, hearing its name, bolted toward them. "Come on, boy." The dog jumped into the plane just as James scrambled into the cockpit. His hands flew over the controls, adrenaline pushing him into full focus. The engine roared to life, but as the propellers spun, James caught movement from the corner of his eye. The masked figure had gotten up, and they were aiming the gun directly. At them final seconds, James's fingers gripped the throttle. If he didn't take off now, they were done for. The shepherd stood in the doorway, growling, ready to pounce again. Daniel, barely conscious, whispered, "James." James didn't think. He just acted. With a sharp pull, the plane lurched forward. The masked figure fired. The bullet grazed the fuselage, barely missing the windshield. But James didn't stop. Faster. The wheels skidded along the runway. The engine roared. Faster. The masked figure ran after them, but it was too late. The nose lifted. Then, they were in the air. The ground fell away beneath them, the airfield shrinking into darkness. James exhaled, his hands gripping the controls, so tightly his knuckles turned white. The German shepherd let out a single, satisfied bark. They had made it, for now. The truth awaits. James glanced at Daniel. He was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes were open. "Daniel," James said urgently. "Who were they? Why were you locked up?" Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't an accident, James," he murmured. "My plane didn't crash." James felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Daniel turned his head slightly, his expression haunted. "They didn't want me to leave because I know something they would kill to keep secret." James felt a chill creep down his being. "What secret, Daniel?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, then whispered, "The plane I was flying that day. It wasn't supposed to land. It was carrying something dangerous." James's pulse quickened. Before he could ask anything else, Daniel's voice dropped even lower. "And the people who locked me up?" He swallowed hard. "They aren't done with us yet." The German shepherd let out a low, uneasy growl, staring out the window as if sensing something James couldn't see. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Not even close. Hunted in the sky, James's hands tightened on the controls. As Daniel's words sank in, "They aren't done with us yet." The German shepherd, still growling, stood by the plane's door, ears pricked, eyes locked on something outside. James followed the dog's gaze, and his blood ran cold. A dark shape was moving in the distance. At first, it was just a speck against the night sky, but within seconds it became clear. It was another plane. And it was coming straight for them. Aerial pursuit, James felt his stomach twist. That's not a coincidence. Daniel tried to sit up, his breath shaky. "They're coming to finish the job." James didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle forward, the engine roaring as the plane surged ahead. The pursuing aircraft accelerated, its lights glowing like predators' eyes in the darkness. James's mind raced. If they were willing to shoot at them on the ground, what would stop them from taking them down up here? A voice crackled over the radio, a deep mechanical tone. "Turn around, now." James ignored it. "This is your last warning." Daniel gritted his teeth. "If we don't lose them now, we're dead." James's jaw clenched. "Hold on." Then, he cut the engine. The free fall. The sudden drop sent Daniel lurching forward. The shepherd yelped, scrambling to keep balance as gravity yanked them downward. Pursuing plane shot past them. Unable to slow down in time, James immediately reignited the engine. The propellers roared to life, and the plane leveled out just before hitting the tree line. But their pursuers weren't giving up. The other aircraft was already turning back. "They're going to fire," Daniel muttered. panic in his voice. James's heart pounded. He had no weapons, no backup, just a dying engine, a half-conscious friend, and a dog that refused to leave their side. Then the German Shepherd did something unexpected. It barked. Once, twice. Then it leaped onto the co-pilot seat, staring. At the dashboard, at something James hadn't noticed before. A small, blinking light. Daniel's eyes widened. That's a distress beacon. James felt a jolt of hope. If we activate it, they'll know where we are. But they had no choice. James reached forward, flicking the switch. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a signal was sent. And now, all they could do was survive long enough for someone to find them. One last move. The enemy plane was closing in again. James needed to think fast. "Brace yourselves," he muttered. Then, with a sharp jerk of the controls, he sent their plane into a spiral dive. Wind screamed past them. The world blurred. Daniel gripped the seat. The German Shepherd crouched low, body tense. The enemy aircraft tried to follow, but it was too fast. As James pulled up at the last second, the other plane shot past them, straight into the storm clouds ahead. Lightning flashed. The radio crackled. Then, silence. They were alone, for now. Landing in the unknown, James knew they couldn't stay in the air much longer. The engine was failing. Fuel was running low, and Daniel needed help. "Hang on," he said. "We're going down." The Shepherd barked in agreement. The ground rushed toward them. A dense jungle, endless trees stretching into the horizon. James spotted a small clearing, his only chance. He adjusted the controls. Lower, lower. Then, impact. The plane hit the ground hard, skidding through the mud and grass before coming to a shaky stop. Silence. Then, a sound in the distance. James's stomach twisted. They weren't alone, the final threat. The German Shepherd growled. Something or someone was approaching. Daniel coughed, struggling to sit up. "James!" James turned slowly and froze. A group of men stepped out from the shadows, armed, waiting, smiling. One of them stepped forward. "We've been expecting you." The German Shepherd let out a low, dangerous growl. James clenched his fists. This fight wasn't over. A trap in the jungle, James's pulse pounded in his ears as he faced the armed men. The German Shepherd stood firm at his side, muscles tensed, growling low and steady. Daniel, still weak from his injuries, shifted slightly, trying to sit up in the cockpit. He squinted at the men. "Who are they?" James didn't answer. He already knew. The same people who had shot at them, the same people who had tried to kill them in the air. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his eyes held a cold amusement. He held his gun, casually, as if he didn't need to use it, as if they had already lost. "Long way from home, aren't you, boys?" The man said, smirking. His gaze flickered to the Shepherd. "And you brought a pet, how cute." The dog snarled in response. James kept his hands in sight, careful not to make any sudden moves. "What do you want?" The man chuckled. "Oh, we already got what we wanted." He gestured behind him, and for the first time James noticed a second group of men, dragging something large through the jungle, or someone. Daniel's face darkened. "No?" James's stomach twisted. He knew what, or rather who, they had captured. The scientist they had been sent to rescue. The real mission, it all made sense now. This wasn't just an accident. This was a setup. James and Daniel had been hired, under the impression that they were simply extracting a scientist in danger. But the truth ran much deeper. This scientist, Dr. Alan Carter, had been working on something classified, something so dangerous that these men would do anything to make sure he never left the jungle alive. And now James and Daniel were just loose ends. The leader raised his gun slightly. "Here's the deal. You're going to turn around, get back in that wreck of a plane, and disappear. Forget what you saw. Forget everything. And maybe, just maybe, we'll let you live." James's jaw tightened. Daniel muttered under his breath. "We're not leaving. Without Carter. James glanced at the shepherd. The dog hadn't stopped growling, its fur standing on end. The shepherd wasn't afraid, and neither was James. "You want us to leave," James said, stepping forward. "Then why'd you go through all this trouble to bring us here?" The leader's smirk faded. His fingers twitched over the trigger. That was all James needed. He moved. The escape plan before them. Man could react. James lunged, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard. The gun fired, a wild shot into the air before James yanked it free. Chaos erupted. The German shepherd sprang into action, leaping at one of the armed men, its teeth clamping down on his arm. The man screamed, trying to shake the dog off, but it held firm. Daniel, despite his injuries, threw himself at another attacker, knocking him down. James turned, raising the stolen gun, just in time to block a punch. The leader recovered fast, slamming his fist into James's ribs. Pain exploded through his side, but James gritted his teeth and fought back. The jungle filled with shouts, gunfire, and the growls of the shepherd as it tore through their enemies. Like a shadow of vengeance, James ducked, kicked, fired, and suddenly it was over. The last attacker hit the ground unconscious. The leader lay groaning, clutching his shoulder where James had struck him. The German shepherd trotted back to James's side, blood on its muzzle, eyes burning with adrenaline. James exhaled heavily. Daniel staggered up. "That was insane." James wiped sweat from his brow. "It's not over yet." They turned to the scientist, Dr. Carter, who lay bound on the ground, his face bruised but his eyes sharp with understanding. "We need to go," James said. Dr. Carter nodded. "Then we'd better hurry. They won't be the only ones looking for us." James met the shepherd's eyes. Something told him this fight was just beginning. James's breath was ragged as he crouched behind a thick tree trunk, gripping the stolen gun tightly. The jungle was eerily silent now, too silent. The enemy was still out there, regrouping, and he knew they wouldn't give up that easily. The German shepherd, still alert, stood by his side, ears pricked forward. It had already proven its intelligence and loyalty, but now James needed it more than ever. "Daniel," James whispered, glancing at his injured co-pilot. "Can you move?" Daniel gritted his teeth, nodding. "Barely, but I'll manage." Dr. Carter, still tied up but now conscious, eyed them both. "They won't stop hunting us," he muttered. "Not until they get what they came for." James narrowed his eyes. And what exactly did they come for? Dr. Carter hesitated before answering. A formula, one that could change the world or destroy it. James didn't have time to process that. Footsteps rustled in the distance. The enemy was closing in. He exchanged a quick glance with the shepherd. The dog's tail was rigid, nose twitching. It sensed the danger before James could even see it. "They're circling us," Daniel whispered. James made a split-second decision. "We have to move, now." They sprinted through the dense foliage, the German shepherd leading the way. Shots rang out behind them, bullets shredding leaves and splintering tree bark. James ducked, dragging Dr. Carter with him. Daniel limped. Behind, the shepherd suddenly halted, barking sharply. James skidded to a stop. A cliff, a sheer drop at least 100 feet down. Below, a raging river crashed against jagged rocks. Trapped. The enemy's voices grew louder. They were closing in. Fast. James turned to Daniel and Carter, his mind racing for a solution. Then the shepherd did something unexpected. It jumped. For a split second, James's heart stopped. But then, a splash. The dog had leapt into the river below. James stared, then made a choice. Jump! Without hesitation, he grabbed Dr. Carter and dove. The icy water swallowed them whole. Daniel followed, and within seconds, the current swept them away. Just as gunfire exploded from above, the enemy had lost them. For now. The river carried them downstream, tossing them like rag dolls. James fought to keep his head above water, his eyes frantically searching for the shepherd. Then, he saw it. The German shepherd swam against the current, fighting with everything it had. It was exhausted but determined. James kicked towards it, grabbing hold of its scruff just as they reached calmer waters. One by one, they crawled onto the riverbank, gasping for breath. Daniel collapsed onto his back, coughing. "I swear, if I survive this, I'm never flying again." Dr. Carter sat, up shaking. "We need to keep moving. Those men will find another way down." James looked at the shepherd. "What do you think, boy?" The dog, soaked and shivering, wagged its tail weakly before standing up. It wasn't done yet. With the shepherd leading them once again, they trekked deeper into the jungle. Hours passed. Every step was agonizing, but they couldn't stop now. Then, finally, a road, and in the distance the faint sound of an approaching vehicle. James waved his arms as headlights came into view. The truck screeched to a halt, and a group of allies, sent after their distress signal, jumped out. They were safe. Days later, James stood on an airstrip watching as Dr. Carter was escorted away under heavy protection. The scientist turned back, giving James a knowing look before disappearing into the armored vehicle. James knew this wasn't truly over. Whatever Carter had discovered, it was bigger than any of them had realized. James exhaled, glancing down at the German shepherd sitting loyally beside him. The dog, now clean and wearing a temporary collar given by the rescue team, wagged its tail slightly, watching him with intelligent eyes. "You really saved us back there," James murmured, kneeling beside the dog. "You didn't have to, but you did." The shepherd leaned in, pressing its head against James's chest. A rare moment of peace washed over him. This dog wasn't just any stray. It had been on a mission of its own, just like him. And now, they were connected in a way he couldn't explain. Daniel, still bruised but recovering, walked up to them. "So what happens now?" he asked, nodding toward the dog. "Airport security wants to know what to do with our four-legged hero." James looked at the shepherd, a smile tugging at his lips. "I think I already know." Minutes later, James climbed into the cockpit of a smaller private jet, preparing for departure. The shepherd sat in the co-pilot's seat, ears perked, watching every move he made. It was almost as if the dog had been meant to fly with him all along. As the engines roared to life, James glanced at his new companion. "What do you say, boy? Ready for the next adventure?" The dog let out a happy bark, tail wagging. James grinned and took off into the sky, knowing that no matter what came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone.